This is the fourth meeting in our series, at least as part of this collective effort. And we are really happy to welcome here today Professor John Torpey from the City University of New York. To introduce Professor Torpey is Professor José Mauricio Domingues here.
Well, thank you, Mariana. Well, we have then John Torpey from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. John has a first degree in political science, then he took his PhD at Berkeley, California, University of California. He taught also at the University of California, Irvine, and the University of British Columbia, and has been in the Graduate Center at CUNY, New York for a good while now. He was director there of the Halfbunch Center for International Studies. He was Fulbright Distinguished Chair in American Studies in Austria, and he has published a considerable amount of books, chapters, articles, including first his dissertation, doctoral dissertation on intellectual socialism and social. Yes, I wrote it wrong here. And I've lost the word. What's going on? Intellectual socialism, a dissent, the invention of passports, a book which is relatively small, but which is one which I particularly like, the Three Axial Ages, making whole what has been smashed. And he has been editor of several books also and several journals, fellow at the European University, more than once a fellow of the AAD. Oh, that is a very substantial and long CV, which I'll stop repeating here in order that we can have the lecture straight away. Thank you very much, Sean, for your presence. We're very happy that you're with us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Jose, or Mauricio, as I guess I know you better. I want to thank Sergio and Mariana and Wolfgang Knöbel and Valentina, who's helping make this all happen. It's an honor to be here. It's the hottest day we've had in New York this year, and maybe the hottest day of the year. It's 95 degrees out, so I'm using a technology that I don't particularly like, but today I'm going to use it, namely an air conditioner. So I hope that's not too loud and getting in our way. This is also by far the most global lecture I've ever given, at least as far as I can recall. And it sounds like a fantastic idea, what you've put together to have these two audiences from halfway around the world from each other together. And I guess I'm sort of the hypotenuse today. And hopefully I will make that work. So I was asked, or in any case, we agreed to talk about the social contract in the 21st century. And in this paper, I argue that there are three factors determining the emerging 21st century social contract in the US and beyond. The first is a cultural factor. As I will try to show, the search for identity, quote unquote, now shapes much contemporary thinking about the self and hence about politics. Second, the political economy, which spurs fears of disappearing jobs and a persistent yet growing gap in rewards between labor and capital, pushes toward universalistic policy solutions that would protect the vulnerable. Yet the universalistic policies that may seem obvious from the point of view of political economy face serious obstacles from a I address each of these factors in turn and propose that the answer to our challenges lies in a rejuvenated understanding of citizenship. And while some of the phenomena I describe here are relevant to other countries, most of the empirical material is drawn from American experience. So basically there's three parts to this talk, as I say, identity, political economy, and citizenship. So let me start by talking a bit about identity. Educated populations in the United States have, over the past few decades, increasingly been shaped by a preoccupation with identities. The identities in question, which are racial, gender-based, sexual, and more, have proliferated and hardened over time, driving wedges through populations that might be consolidated politically if they communicated in a different idiom, namely, I would argue, that of class. Is solidarity possible if social and political groups are defined chiefly in terms of their differences? Or, as former Social Democratic president of the German Bundestag, Wolfgang Thierse, has asked in recent years, how much identity can society stand? And I would mention, since Mauricio mentioned my dissertation, that I first got to know Wolfgang Thierse when I was researching that project 30 years ago, when he was a rising social democratic star from the East German milieu. So this paper will argue that the emphasis on identity and difference is creating divisions that should be less salient if this aim is to create progressive social change and a more durable social contract for the 21st century. So I want to claim that the problem of the 21st century is the problem of identity, at least for the educated classes in the West. It seems to me this is a puzzle because arguably the chief social fact of the past several decades has been the growing inequality in the United States and in many Anglo-Saxon countries more broadly. Inequality across countries, as we know from the work of my colleague at the Graduate Center, Branko Milanovic, has declined during this period. Those of you familiar with his so-called elephant curve that shows the growing share of the global distribution of wealth captured by the poorer parts of the world and the declining share garnered by the working and middle classes in the wealthier parts of the world, will be familiar with these findings. The problem of identity coincides with, if it is not an outgrowth of, in other words, it correlates, but it may not necessarily be caused by the growing inequality in the US since the 1970s. Identity has become, over the past few decades, a central preoccupation of the educated classes in the United States and beyond. The term is used as a way of talking about some elusive yet essential inner self. The philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah has noted recently in an interview that this usage is novel and not more than 75 years old at most. The preoccupation with identity might be characterized as the quintessential post-materialist concern, alongside things like environmentalism, gender equality, personal autonomy, self-expression, and such lifestyle concerns as vegetarianism or veganism. Its prevalence is sometimes attributed to the psychoanalytically oriented writer Erik Erikson, who made the term well known to educated audiences with books such as Identity and the Life Cycle in 1959 and Identity, Youth, and Crisis in 1968. The interest in identity is a product, it seems to me, of the expansion of higher education in the United States since the 1950s, which brought greater diversity into the university student population than had existed previously. And the interest in identity was part and parcel of the then emerging therapeutic culture. But its roots are much deeper than the period of post-war affluence from which contemporary identitarianism sprang. As Francis Fukuyama has recently argued, the contemporary concern with identity was a novel demand for recognition of one's uniqueness. It was a claim to authenticity that, in Rousseauian fashion, sought to bring out the individual's true self by sloughing off the corrupting constraints of society. As one teenager put it in discussing her sexual predispositions, she wanted everyone to know that, quote, they do not align with the boundaries that have been set up, unquote. And I take that from an account in the local paper in the sort of suburb of New York where I live, where these matters have been somewhat contentious of late. So it seems to me the echoes of American individualism reverberate through the contemporary preoccupation with identity among educated groups. And I'm aware that to some degree, my problematizing this notion of identity may make me seem superannuated, and that this is in many ways a generational phenomenon. So I'm trying to account for where it came from and how it has come to shape, if you like, a discourse about social life that is very different than the one that I grew up with and that most of the organizers of this series grew up with. So one's identity was perhaps first invoked as a grounding for progressive political activism by the Combahee River Collective, which declared in 1977 that its members' lived experience could be the foundation for their political endeavors as much as any abstract theory. Identities, which were soon pluralized, increasingly became the universe within which people thought of themselves and their political horizons. To be progressive became more and more a matter of aligning one's political concerns with one's expressive concerns. The goal of politics, once more associated with the question cui bono, that is, who benefits, was now to be recognized publicly for the differences between one's true self and the routines of the mainstream. The demand for recognition of one's authentic self did not necessarily portend political success, however. The modern world, the world ushered in by the French Revolution, arrived with a promise that everyone would, that all people would be recognized for their intrinsic dignity, irrespective of their achievements. This was a development deeply rooted in Christian understanding of the individual's relationship with God, but it was an aspiration, not a reality. In empirical fact, many people were not recognized as fully human. Contemporary identity politics is an attempt to erase the gap between aspiration and reality. In contrast to a materialist politics that demands a fairer distribution of wealth for everyone, identity politics seeks recognition of the authentic self. And of course, Nancy Fraser has made famous the sort of distinction between redistribution and recognition as forms of politics. This demand, while it comports well with the modern expectation of equal recognition for all, nonetheless asks people to recognize persons for something that they are, that distinguishes them from most of the rest. People who may have little sense of what the person wants recognition for are told to celebrate diversity, even though they may experience that diversity as unfamiliar and disquieting. There are therefore likely to be limits to the recognition of diversity, especially among the less educated, as opposed to tolerance. Recognition is a more sort of assertive, affirmative kind of idea. Wokeness, to use for descriptive purposes, a shorthand I usually avoid because it's meant to be derogatory, is an ideology, however, of the well-educated, an expression of their high status and of the justness of their cultural dominance. The concern with identity is intrinsically likely to entail, I think, a pessimistic view of political possibilities. The rise of the notion of white supremacy, once reserved for the pre-1965 United States and apartheid-era South Africa, and little used until about 10 years ago, reflects the pessimistic outlook of much contemporary identity politics. While the past 60 years have seen the end of Jim Crow segregation, the enfranchisement of the Black population, and the rise of the Black middle class, contemporary anti-racism in the United States sees the country as irredeemably committed to a notion of racial domination, namely white supremacy, that I don't think describes very well the racial hierarchy that actually exists today. Rather than a white over non-white configuration, I would argue that our racial system pits, shall we say, non-Blacks against Blacks, and to a lesser extent, Native Americans. It must be kept in mind that East Asian and South Asian families in the United States earn more on average than whites, Latinos, and Blacks. And of course, controversy swirls over the disproportionate success of Asians in the pursuit of elite educational opportunities at the alleged, at least, expense of Blacks and Latinos. So despite the frequent invocation of the notion of BIPOC, that is Black, Indigenous, people of color, and people of color. I don't think this scenario portends success for this putative political coalition. Meanwhile, so-called Afro-pessimism has arisen only a few years after prominent Black social democratic analyst William Julius Wilson declared what he called the declining significance of race in understanding contemporary racial inequality. Wilson emphasized the importance of education in the emergence of a Black middle class and the difficulties Black men had in finding satisfactory employment in the wake of deindustrialization. Black men continue to lag behind Black women in educational attainment, making non-college Black men the worst off segment of the American population. Still, as we know from the work of Ann Case and Angus Deaton at Princeton, non-college educated white men, have also been faring badly in recent years to the extent that their life expectancy has declined due to what these authors call deaths of despair, including suicide, drug overdoses, and by alcohol abuse. Case and Dayton attribute the epidemic of deaths of despair to the deterioration of economic and social supports faced by less educated middle-aged white men. The result has been compared to the effects on Russian men of the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, which brought about a decline in life expectancy unprecedented in peacetime. Just grab a drink here. American politics has reflected, of course, some of these developments. Two populisms arose, one of the left and one of the right, in the 2016 presidential candidacies of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, respectively. Sanders' social democratic platform, with its stress on redistributing wealth and taxing the rich, appealed to a coalition of better educated and working class voters of all races. Although many of his voters were business owners and managers, Trump emphasized that he, quote, loved the poorly educated, unquote, and they tended to respond in kind. This all tended to refer to whites, however, to whom he appealed with dog whistles regarding their racial superiority. This all became more explicit after Trump won the presidency and far-right elements organized a rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, promoting the Great Replacement theory that recently motivated a mass murderer in Buffalo. Trump thought there were good people, as he put it, on both sides of the Unite the Right rally that resulted in the death of an anti-racist activist. Notwithstanding his thoroughly unlikable qualities, many working class people seem to have thought that Trump spoke for them. His support for Social Security and his opposition to globalization and to foreign entanglements made sense to many ordinary people undergoing wrenching social change. Trump's chaotic administration led to missteps in responding to the coronavirus pandemic, but also to the miraculously quick invention of safe and effective vaccines. Yet Trump had sown so much division in the country that the United States fared poorly in responding to the pandemic, despite having remarkable tools with which to defend itself. His administration's response to the pandemic sealed Trump's defeat in the 2020 elections. Democrat Joe Biden won the contest with what seemed like a mandate to do big things for the country, which had spent enormous sums of money to fend off the economic threat posed by the pandemic. Biden planned to take advantage of the crisis to do more of the same. He was going to build back better, as we know, and on a huge scale. Unfortunately, the narrowly divided Senate, and in particular a West Virginia Democrat who managed to hold his seat in a state that Trump won by 30-point margins, led to a stalemate in Congress and Biden's inability to do the FDR-sized things he had planned to do. And soon, inflation began to take off, whether due to the large amount of pandemic-induced federal spending or because of shortages caused by supply chain difficulties. Whatever the cause, the result was that Biden was forced to trim his sails and to make inflation, rather than his vision of rebuilding and modernizing the country, his number one domestic priority. Meanwhile, the country, the United States, also remained mired in culture wars that gave the Republicans unearned advantages in elections. The progressive left had come to be associated heavily with ideas such as defunding the police, liberal immigration policies, critical race theory, and opposition to parental influence in their children's schooling. The latter, as some of you will know, the latter played a significant role in the defeat of former Democratic governor of Virginia, Terry McAuliffe, by a financier named Glenn Youngkin. In the meantime, Florida Governor Rick DeSantis has gone further in the direction of the politics of culture war, after the Disney company, which has essentially run its own mini state over the past several decades, opposed a law dubbed by critics "Don't Say Gay." Governor DeSantis, announced that he was stripping the company of its special status. In other words, he was using the power of the state to punish what conservatives now deride as so-called woke capital, when it contravened his views of how Florida's schools should teach sexuality. I mean, these are the kinds of things that are drawing comparisons to Viktor Orban's Hungary. Many think DeSantis has a better chance than Trump of winning the Republican nomination and the presidency in 2024, basically because he's less chaotic and more disciplined than Trump himself. This is in part also because DeSantis is savvy about picking enemies. He was prepared to take on Disney because he could wrong foot the company in the eyes of the public on an issue that attracts great attention, namely the place of sexuality in children's and families' lives. The issue of trans teens has been growing increasingly contentious around the country. But DeSantis's position, which is seen as, very conservative, and is basically to move cautiously in regard to medical interventions concerning young people, is comparable, in fact, to that being taken now by social democratic countries in good standing, such as Finland, Sweden, the UK, and France. It's also important to note that these may be fraught decisions within families, and keeping parents out of the loop regarding a teen's transition to a different gender is sure to stimulate backlash from parents who are told that they don't have a role to play in those decisions. In comparison to more bread and butter issues such as taxation of the wealthy, child tax credits, earned income tax credits, the cost of pharmaceuticals, and the like, the issues that the progressive left has taken to heart are bound to generate controversy. Defunding the police, loosening immigration policies, and facilitating changes in teens' sexuality without the input of the parents are views that are not at the heart of the concerns of ordinary people trying to make a living. These are the preoccupations of elites and poll poorly among many of the people they are supposed to help. As a result, they're fueling a drift of working class voters, including Blacks and especially Latinos, into the Republican Party. Trump did better with these groups in 2020 than he had in 2016, despite his image, not incorrect, as a virulent racist. Some of the groups he had antagonized nonetheless saw him as their standard bearer. Against this background, the social compact in the United States is likely to look different than it did in the post-FDR era, when the Democrats were the party of the working class. But that can no longer be taken for granted, that the Democratic Party is a vehicle of the working class. The Republicans increasingly seem to be capturing the imagination of ordinary voters of all races. Although it's true that working class people still, by majorities, vote Democratic. While identitarianism has come to dominate the culture, a more familiar left-wing universalism has taken wing in the political economy. And some of this certainly had to do with the pandemic. It was widely observed that those forced by dint of circumstances to continue working their jobs in the so-called touch economy during the coronavirus crisis tended to be the most at risk of infection, and yet often lacked health insurance because the jobs they had simply didn't provide any benefits. They were just wages only. These circumstances meant that they could not afford not to work, were not paid to stay at home when sick in order to avoid infecting others. And when they did get sick, they often lacked the wherewithal to get the care they needed. The result was that they died in greater numbers, greater relative numbers, certainly. One obvious response to this was to insist on a more complete universal health insurance system than we actually have in the United States. Another response was to argue for universal basic income, which would have allowed some at-risk people to forego the need to work, at least temporarily, which would have been good for everybody, I mean, not just for them. It would have helped those who were summarily thrown out of work as in-person service and hospitality industry jobs were immediately eliminated as the pandemic descended. The United States tended to approach pandemic-related income supports differently than Western European countries did. Germany, France, and other European social democracies subsidized the wages of people who were kept on in their jobs, even though there was no real demand for their efforts. In the United States, in contrast, the government increased funding for unemployment insurance and propped up small businesses with temporary resources meant to keep them from going under. Universal basic income, which became the central theme of Andrew Tech, whatever he was, tech entrepreneur Andrew Yang's 2020 presidential campaign, has increasingly taken its place in policy discussions in the United States. And policy discussions regarding employment and income. Yet a third policy response was the expanded child tax credit. The United States is one of the few countries that lacks a child allowance, which is of course a fairly routine feature of social democratic welfare states elsewhere. As part of the American Rescue Plan passed by Congress in 2021, the expanded child tax credit functioned as a de facto minimum income for families with children and reduced child poverty, according to various studies, between 25 and 40%, which is a remarkable achievement in so short a time. But despite its successes, Congress has allowed the policy to lapse, though it may not yet be entirely dead. They're still kind of talking about it in Congress. Another broad-based policy focusing on children is the idea of universal pre-kindergarten. Getting kids into school earlier would help level the playing field as children enter the school-age years. Research has shown that kids less exposed to a high-quality, word-rich learning environment are likely to do less well academically, earn less in their lifetimes, and live less healthy and shorter lives. The sooner we can get children of all backgrounds into good schools, the better off everyone in the country will be. The relatively small investment in these early years pays dividends both for the individuals concerned and for the United States as a whole for a long time after they're made. Finally, my own New Jersey Senator Cory Booker has proposed the idea of creating what are called baby bonds, among other things, as a way of closing the racial wealth gap. The idea involves contributing, say, $1,000 to each newborn at birth, up to some, insofar as they're members of families, up to some family maximum income threshold, which Booker said would be $150,000 a year. The money could be added to, but would otherwise be untouchable until the account holder reached the age of majority. At that point, the money, which would have grown at least with the interest accrued in a savings account, could be used for further education, starting a small business, or other qualifying purposes. So creating a nest egg for, or what we call a nest egg for everyone, irrespective of income up to that threshold, would make at least a small contribution to economic equality and more specifically to closing the racial wealth gap. The problem the United States is facing in making these kinds of policy moves is that the country is deeply polarized politically and seemingly unable to do anything constructive beyond responding to emergencies. Although major problems such as climate change or gun violence seem unable to generate compromise solutions, it should be recalled that the members of the United States Congress agreed to spend enormous sums of money in the early days of the pandemic in their efforts to address the crisis. And vaccines are a good example of this. I mean, vaccines arrived like manna from heaven by the end of 2020, but not in time to save Donald Trump from electoral defeat. If only barely, the country seemed to want a sane leader who would steer things back to normal. By then, however, Donald Trump had succeeded in politicizing such seemingly ordinary responses to the crisis as masks and indeed vaccinations themselves. The result was that the country suffered considerably more unnecessary or excess deaths than might have been the case if many of his supporters had not declined to defend themselves against the virus on political grounds. Trump's division of the country along party lines had and has so riven the United States that people were dying because they thought he wanted them to eschew masking and vaccines, which of course Trump himself took, notwithstanding his showy removal of a mask upon arriving at the White House after being treated for a bout of COVID. The divisions that Trump had laid bare were stark and unforgiving. He was a genius, is a genius at promoting enmity across lines of class and culture, and he's thus a culture warrior par excellence. Perhaps the most apparent divisions were those between urban coastal liberals and inland rural conservatives, a division increasingly found in other countries in Europe and elsewhere as well. The latter constituted a small proportion of the population, but that didn't matter in a system in which every state gets 2 senators. If rural states elect 40 Republicans to the upper chamber, that is to the Senate in the United States, they can control much of what happens at the national level in American politics because many bills require a so-called supermajority of 60 votes. The cultural divisions between conservatives and liberals regarding critical race theory, LGBTQ rights, anti-racism, and other hot-button issues had brought the United States to a fever pitch of polarization. So how's the United States going to move past this time of division? If it's going to continue as a viable democracy, which at the moment many people doubt is possible, Americans are going to have to find common ground upon which to build. The one institution that already exists as a foundation for that common ground is the institution of citizenship. That institution binds us together into a community of fate. Citizens share a political system that shapes the choices they make collectively. In order to persuade Americans that they can determine their fate collectively, they have to believe that their voice is heard. The lack of that sense has, of course, promoted populist movements on both ends of the political spectrum. And that's understandable, but political majorities are found in the center of the political spectrum. Shared citizenship gives people a reason to be concerned about the well-being of their fellow citizens. It is the basis on which the American founders enjoined us to build a more perfect union, for those of you familiar with the constitutional language. Attacks on voting rights, of which there have been many in recent years, discourage the notion that we are all in this together. They suggest instead that some people seek to achieve their ends through partisan advantage rather than the strength of their arguments. Such an approach to politics can only breed cynicism about the system. And of late, Republicans say they will take on the Supreme Court ruling in Plyler versus Doe, the 1982 decision that guaranteed non-citizens access to schooling and other services. Given the large number of undocumented persons in the United States today, denying schooling to undocumented immigrant children is a counterproductive policy that would, as critics claimed at the time, lead to the emergence of an ill-educated underclass. The United States needs to find a way to reform its immigration laws and to incorporate at least those who did not come here by their own choice, not to turn immigrants who are already here into a stratum of helots. Citizenship must be rejuvenated in order for the United States to serve its population fairly and to achieve equality. Recall that T.H. Marshall's argument about citizenship concerned its importance as an antidote to the economic inequality generated by capitalism. Given the gravity of this concern in recent decades, Marshall's arguments are worth revisiting. In addition to legal and political equality, Marshall emphasized the need for strong social services. By these, he was referring to both the welfare state as we normally think of it, that is, transfer payments, redistributing wealth, income supports, and the like, and a system of education that gives everyone a chance to rise. We have been chastened in regard to educational mobility by the work of such figures as Pierre Bourdieu, who identified the non-meritocratic bases of meritocracy resulting from the unequal distribution of economic and educational capital. The fact that meritocracy is not as meritocratic as it might be is no reason to throw out the baby with the bathwater, however. Meritocracy is a rational way to distribute social rewards, even if we have a long way to go and before we have dismantled its non-meritocratic elements. But we also have to think beyond meritocracy, which rewards people really only on the basis of their contributions, which can themselves be transformed into capital that yields subsequent unearned gains. We have to restore the idea of service to the community as an essential part of citizenship. Military service is in many quarters out of fashion and prepares people for activities that we will hopefully avoid having to engage in, even if the Russian invasion of Ukraine reminds us that such service is sometimes unavoidable. On the other hand, military service brings together people from more diverse class backgrounds and racial backgrounds, of course, than they would likely encounter otherwise, broadening their perspectives. AmeriCorps has replaced military service obligations with more peaceful ones, as has long occurred in the case of Germany's Zivildienst, or civil service, replacing military service. But this is still a volunteer experience. We need to find other ways to get young people to experience themselves as community builders. So citizenship is the coin of a functioning democratic polity that recognizes its members' uniqueness, but subsumes them in a larger collective purpose. Only so can everyone prosper and thrive. Thank you for your attention. Everybody there?
Yes.
Okay.
Outer space.
Sorry?
No, it's just a joke, but doesn't matter. Someone must be first. I'm always first, so it's.
Well, I've been first the past few weeks, but we're having trouble here. I can only see you guys when it's when it's minimized. So if someone can jump in, please, and start with the questions, we'll try to figure it out here.
Okay, can just start then. Thank you so much, John, for this really very, very relevant and also thoughtful talk. Of course, it's not necessary to emphasize the points I agree. I just jump to the points I disagree with you, or at least I need some clarification. I'd ask you to give some clarification, especially concerning 2 points. The first one is the way you present identity politics and let's say more universal politics or the policies. In that sense that at least according to my perception, you present this in a sort of opposition way. But at the end, if you look at concrete movements, such as Black movements in different parts of the world, indigenous movements and so on, what they are trying to do is actually to construct more equality, is to fight against inequality. It's not just a aesthetic movement for identity as a sort of post-material. Of course, there is also post-material movements, but the most important movements exactly connect fights for recognition and fights for redistribution. In that sense, also the debate recognition versus redistribution, I don't think that makes sense. So at the end, you have intersectional inequalities, which can only be addressed in an intersectional way. And this intersectional way implies also a different positionalities of people in different social structures, combining gender, race, and so on. So therefore, perhaps you can clarify why you actually put these 2 axes of justice, let's say, that in that separate way. And the second question, I will try to connect your reference to Milanovic elephant curve with citizenship, because I don't know if I understood you well, but my impression is that Milanovic with the elephant curve is not showing that global inequalities are no longer important. So even if there is a reduction of global inequality in comparison to inequalities within countries, is still a very relevant aspect in that sense that you have some countries, especially China and India, which actually contribute to this decline in the inequalities between countries, but you have even more distance in countries in Africa and also some Latin American countries. Therefore, coming back to the citizenship solution you present. So citizenship, at least as you know, citizenship is a national entity, a national institution. So how to deal with this, even if they are decreasing the inequalities between countries, but they are still very important. How to fight inequalities at a global level using the instruments of citizenship. Sorry, I know these are broad questions, but just to start the discussion.
No, thank you very much. I mean, these are both right on point and hugely important questions. And, you know, I mean, I've thought a lot about these things. A lot of what I talked about today is the product of the research that I've been doing on a book on sort of anti-racism and class. And, but it's, you know, it's heavily shaped by the American experience. And I mean, my perspective on these things is heavily shaped by the American experience, and you know, goes back to the book that I did on reparations 15 years ago or something. And you know, one of the conclusions that I came to about racial inequality in the United States and how you address it is that you know, race conscious, if you like, if you want to use that language, race conscious policies tend not to be very successful in the United States. And that's partially because the United States is not South Africa, you know, where the black population was by far the vast majority of the country. In the United States, they're 13 or something, 14% of the population. And so, you know, they must.
Let's hope he comes back.
Yes, during the talk, there were also some interruptions, but short interruptions. Yeah.
Yeah, some weird stuff, but not very clear interruption. And now it's absolute,
Yeah.
radical.
He's completely frozen.
It's the heat. Wow, now he's gone. Or maybe you try to.
Yeah, I told him to leave and come back, so maybe
Okay,
it will
okay,
work
okay. Try
again.
to come back. Yes, maybe it works again.
A lot of technical difficulties here today.
He was in the middle of the most important answer he could give you today.
Yeah, he was saying that race-conscious politics don't work. I want to hear.
No,
the rest
no,
of
he was going to make his point, the most important point he could make today. He was gone. Well, that's complicated.
it. It was our internet.
At least it's not only
Sergio,
Brazil.
you're
and-
muted.
Sergio speaking, but he's muted.
Yes. Okay. No, but it's not relevant. It's just to.
Ah,
To kill time.
my question.
Oh, he's really having problems.
Tô lidando com muita coisa. Ai, gente.
This hasn't happened yet. The only bad problem I had was my microphone. You see, I had a earphone. The microphone, he was broken
It's your
completely.
fault.
I tried to fix it, but you fix it, it gets, it doesn't work again. So I had to buy this, otherwise I have to have an external mic.
We
But-
couldn't see him on the large screen here. We had to watch him in this tiny little screen because every time we blew it up, it just turned black.
Really?
So it's been a strange transmission here all along.
Well, I hope he's back, but it seems to be very complicated now. He should try his cell phone.
Yeah.
Valentina, can you tell him to use his cell phone?
Let's use this time just for a message for the students who send questions, because actually, since we didn't have a article sent by John Torpey, they read another text on the pandemic and inequalities.
Okay, because I was looking for a text and I couldn't find any, so I said, well,
Yes.
Our
am
students read
I
the same
lost
as
here? No, there
editors.
was no text.
So the
No, we read the
question,
same thing as your students.
yeah, the questions are connected to a term-bound text on the
And it's
pandemic and
different.
inequalities. And what I will try to do if John Torpey comes back is to adapt at least one of these questions or two in order also to make justice to the students, yeah, to their questions. But for the next lectures, you have always a text, an article, or a chapter from the lectures themselves. So in that sense, the talk will also be connected to the texts.
My God, where is he?
I told him, he sent me an email. I told him to try to use his cell phone because then he can use his own internet.
Yeah.
If a problem with internet, he could use it independently from the system. I don't know. I think he's at CUNY. Maybe it's a problem with the internet in CUNY, which is strange, but it happened.
It's 95 degrees in New York. Nothing
Yes. Although let's face it, for Brazil, 35 degrees plus
It's like
it's
nothing.
not so hot.
If
but
the
of
internet
course-
didn't work here at 95
Yes.
degrees, nothing would work. We wouldn't get anything done. But yeah, Menos 32 dividido por 2. Dá perto. Essa é a conversão. 95 menos 2. 93 divided by 2. É muito. É por aí, isso é 4,500.
Oh, great.
Good, good. Welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
Well, I guess that tells you something about our infrastructure. I mean, there was just a very brief power outage, but
Really?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
back better. You
not
really need that.
not surprised because of the heat.
It's too hot.
Everybody's got an air conditioner on. I mean, I thought they'd solve these problems, but this is a pretty unusual day. So anyway, I don't know exactly when I got cut off, but I'll just try to go back and, pick where I left off. I think a lot about the question of, how do you address racial inequalities in the United States? And, there's no doubt as compared to Canada, where I used to teach, that, the Black, non-Black divide, as I see in the United States, is the really crucial one. I mean, Native Americans are also pretty, badly disadvantaged too, but they don't take up the space in our, collective consciousness that they do in Canada, for example. So the issue is, what kind of works politically, as much as what I think, might be the right thing ideally or something like that. And so I'm basically over the years come to the view that, what is most likely to be successful is the emphasis on universalistic policies that, as it turns out, because Blacks and Latinos, and although Latinos, of course, are disadvantaged generally for totally different reasons or largely different reasons, or Native Americans are just, very disadvantaged, but for other reasons. The best way to address those things as a political matter in the United States is to emphasize that the benefits are basically for everybody, and, cuts off the predisposition that one finds in American politics, alas, that says, this is for sort of ne'er-do-wells, people who, don't deserve, these funds or whatever. And, I think that's a recurrent problem in American life. So basically it's a kind of concession to the political realities as I understand them. Now, does that solve all problems of racial inequality or even just the problems that Black people face? Is there more at stake than, material or monetary financial inequalities? Well, as I said in the book on reparations, for Blacks in the United States, I think, the issue really is about the money. It's not the only thing, but by and large, what matters and what needs to be fixed is a kind of financial, monetary, material sort of inequality. Whereas for Native Americans, I don't think that's true or as true. I mean, it's certainly an issue, but Native, as Tocqueville said, I mean, Indians, Native Americans can meld into the dominant white or European population. There's nothing keeping them from doing that in the way that was true, has been true of the Black population in the United States. And so, the sort of what's at issue is different in each of these cases, it seems to me. And so, the currency today of the idea of white supremacy is really kind of very puzzling. If you think about, if you look at median family incomes by race or ethnicity, I mean, what you find, notwithstanding the idea that there are no model minorities, among Asians, what you find among the Chinese, or more especially among the Indians, is, the highest median family incomes in the country. Now, this is, not a product of genetic differences or something. It's a product of immigration policies and who's admitted into the country, right? But nonetheless, that's the way it is. And so, the idea that there's going to be a white versus non-white kind of political constellation, to me, makes simply no sense. I mean, the fight that we're going to see at the Supreme Court this fall is whether or not Harvard is going to be forced to change its admissions policies to stop discriminating against Asians, which I think, many parties would agree is what's going on. I mean, Harvard doesn't agree with that, of course, but and this is then a larger question about, racial and ethnic inequality and, many people would say that, the Black and brown populations that increasingly populate places like Princeton and Harvard are, often they're non-American origin populations. They're not what is increasingly referred to as American descendants of slaves, or ADOS populations, which I think are the population we're really talking about when we talk about Black or African American inequality. So, it seems, I don't know that there's a lot of research on this, but it seems that the populations of non-whites who are increasingly to be found at places like Princeton and Harvard, it's not that they're not there, but they're not from this ADOS population. And, the question really, I think, is how do you address that, sort of whatever you want to call it, most difficult to reach group? And that has sort of historically been the main focus of, reparations-oriented activism and that sort of thing. But the idea that it's whites against everybody else, I think just doesn't make any sense, sort of sociologically or politically. Okay. So anyway, that's a long-winded response to your question. I'm not sure it's an answer to your question, but so the second question had to do with Branko Milanovic. And I mean, I think what's striking about the elephant curve, or whatever it's called, is that, if we just talk about Chinese and Indians, close to half of the world's population, when they get better off, that moves the needle in a big way, as you know. And that's not to say that, everybody in Ghana or Zambia is, great, their situation is particularly improved. But the point is that, in sort of global terms and geoeconomic terms, a lot of the world is a lot better off than they were since 1978, say, in China. And that's a fact that I think we need to take into account, even though it is concentrated in really these two countries. But, the improvement in, at least until the pandemic, the improvement in, rates of extreme poverty around the world are dramatic. I mean, we moved from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals because they reached their target for the number of people, or the proportion of the global population in that kind of situation, much faster than they ever expected to. So, I mean, this has all slowed down as a result of the pandemic, to be sure. But before then, the progress was remarkable. A lot of it had to do with what happened in China in 1978. And so the world is a different place as a result of that. And I think, that the salient political thing about to me, about the elephant curve is the question whether or not the improvements in basically China and India were, whether they caused the deterioration of the well-being of the working class and middle class worker in, the first world, and in particular in the United States, sorry. And it seems to me that, Branko does not really answer that question. He's being, a good scholar. But Donald Trump said, of course, the answer is yes. Of course, this is what's screwing us or screwing you. And, that was his answer to what globalization was doing, to the American population. And then I guess you ask about citizenship as an antidote or as a response to this. I mean, my concern is that, I was a student of Todd Gitlin's. I've been reading about identity politics and their consequences for American politics for 30 years. And, I think it's, and I've been sort of more actively involved in this stuff in a way myself lately, for both political and sort of research reasons. And, I think it's hard not to come to the conclusion that when people define themselves kind of first and foremost by their difference, I mean, that's not to say you shouldn't recognize their difference and respect them and accord them dignity as human beings and all that. That to me sort of goes without saying. But the question is, where are our sort of first allegiances? And it seems to me that, what's ready to hand is the idea of citizenship and, can be rejuvenated, in a way, simply like through the schools. I mean, I think so much of what I find problematic about identity politics I see is kind of really something that's being filtered through or inculcated in the schools. And so it's a huge, I mean, I just, when I got into this project, I guess I thought of a lot of these things as sort of over enthusiastic, commitments to sort of self-conceptions that were, in themselves good and unproblematic. But over the past few years, I've come to think that they're actually more of a problem than I had thought, and that we have to start talking more about, universalistic problems or policies that are solutions to anybody who needs them. I don't care what you look like. I don't care what family you come from, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, obviously, one might want to have, income caps, as Cory Booker suggests, for these baby bonds, a family income of $150,000, and that's not nothing. That's a pretty generous policy, but at some point it says, all right, people above this number don't really need our help, and maybe that would be counterproductive politically in its own way, right? So anyway, those are the ways I guess I've come to think about these things, and I absolutely hear your concern and take seriously that it's not all about the money, but insofar as it's about money, we should make it, universalistic. We should make it possible for every kid. And of course, Black kids in the United States, being disproportionately poor, are disproportionately disadvantaged by the ways that we fund, elementary school education, which is by, property taxes. So if you live in a nice fancy town, like where I live, to be honest, your kids go to good schools. But if you live down the street, 2 miles from here in Newark, New Jersey, that's not the story. And that's just not okay. So I hope that's some kind of answer, but I totally appreciate the questions. And, they're very much on point. So thanks.
Thank you so much for this, John. And I'm sorry about the power outage. Who was in line first, Wolfgang or Mauricio? Was it Wolfgang? I thought it was, but I wasn't looking.
Yeah, well, I don't mind. Mauricio, you want to go first?
No, go ahead. We can have both questions in the same sequence, right?
Okay.
The same round. I think it's better.
Yeah. Thanks, John, for this great talk. I would like to press you a little bit more on the political agenda you are addressing. I mean, I would buy your argument that citizenship is basically one of the most important tools in order to integrate a society. And I would also emphasize that you are correct and right to say that universalistic policies might achieve a lot in that direction. But on the other hand, my question would be, I mean, how big are the chances that there is a kind of U-turn within politics which goes into a universalistic direction? I mean, when we are talking about the European welfare state, for example, these kind of universalistic solutions are not that fashionable any longer. And why should we believe that the Americans would go in that direction, or can go in that direction, can build coalitions which go into this direction? Are you really optimistic that that would be the case in the very next future?
Well, whether
actually, my question is more or less the same. I was going to ask something similar, because before the pandemic, you had all this glaring, increasing gap globally between poor and rich, capital, finance capital, millionaires. Everybody was already talking about this and complaining. And then the pandemic exposed very clearly the inequalities of contemporary society. Yet there was a lot of talk about correcting that. Politicians during the pandemic, several of them became a bit excited and suggested they could do something about that. But as we move on, by the end of the pandemic, you see that they are starting to forget this promise. I was reading The Guardian today, an article about the Labour Party in Britain. People criticizing how Boris Johnson deals with politics, how he lies, everything. And then it's clear that the leader of the Labour Party is doing exactly the same. All the promise of stronger social policies, he's already dropping from his program, even before the election comes. So there is a problem there. I think many of the things, or all the things you have said, are very sensible, progressive, and I'm totally sympathetic towards them. But the political system, the way it's structured, seems to be completely closer to the sort of societal demands. Politicians live in a world which I don't understand very well, because it's not so much even capital. In the US, I think this is very clearly the case, because to become a politician, to be elected in the US, you have to have a lot of support from capital. But in Europe, that's not even the case. It's not so direct. It's still people have the same sort of political perspective. You cling to the sort of reforms of labor law, the welfare state, which were not necessarily totally neoliberal, but sort of social liberal solutions or residual solutions for the sort of social problems like Hartz IV in Germany. So I wanted to hear you about the political aspect, I think, like Volk.
Well, I think probably the best thing I could say is pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And, but, and to remain on a Gramscian sort of note, I have come to believe that despite my many other disagreements with Michel Foucault, there is something to the idea that discourses are created, perhaps, if you like, by the powerful and perhaps not, that really shape the way people think about the world and the way they talk about the world. And, again, I think I found myself a little bit blindsided by the extent to which I came to realize how much, again, it's, and it's to a considerable extent a generational phenomenon, that, younger people than I talk about the world in a totally different way, in a way that I find alien and, sort of problematic. And that I think, there may be all kinds of problems with universalism as my, solution to everything. But I think unless we start talking and thinking about things as in other terms, we're never going to get there. And so, I mean, if you think about what happened in Occupy Wall Street and how short-lived that really was, Now, some people say Occupy has had these long-term consequences. It's, fueled or stimulated more, trade union organizing, if only primarily in the public sector in the United States, but of course now in Amazon and Starbucks and places like that. And maybe that's true. But what strikes me among the populations of students that I talk to, or younger faculty, I'm now old enough to be, a generation older than mid-career faculty, and they just talk about the world in a very different way. And it seems to me that it is, the race class, to get back maybe to Sergio's question, I mean, the race class gender triad basically has become about two of those three things. And to me, it's kind of extraordinary how little is said about class. I mean, sometimes there are ritual obeyances kind of made to this triad or this triangle, but not that much is really said about it. And I thought I'd left behind my youthful Marxism, but now it seems increasingly compelling. I mean, what has happened over the past 15 years? I mean, enormous. I remember coming home in 2007, late 2007, turning on the TV to find out whether the world economy had collapsed and, what the hell that might actually mean. But in any case, despite those kind of developments, it seems to me a culturalist kind of language has taken over, has really shaped this generation, or two generations maybe now. And, it's also depressing in the sense that, I think Republicans and conservatives are better at this than the left. And so it often ends up, providing conservatives with a cannon fodder, for their sort of arguments. And I mean, we saw this, I think, in Virginia recently when, Terry McAuliffe, the former Democratic governor who was running again against a financier on the Republican side named Glenn Youngkin, and McAuliffe in a debate said something about he didn't think parents had any role in what their students were taught, their children were taught in school. Now, in certain respects, I understand where that sensibility is coming, but that was a really huge mistake that he made in that election campaign, and people turned on him. So what are you talking about? We don't have a say in what our children learn in school. And, this was compounded by the pandemic experience of a lot of people, being at home, being stuck at home, and seeing a lot more about what their kids were doing in school than they had before, when they had busy lives and they were commuting to jobs and all these kinds of things, right? They got to see, as a result of the pandemic conditions, they got to see a great deal more about what their kids were actually doing in school, and they weren't happy about it. And I mean, the debate about critical race theory is not really a debate. I mean, the right has figured out how to instrumentalize this term. The guy who really grabbed onto it is a guy named Christopher Rufo, who plays a conservative outlet called the Manhattan Institute. And he said, we're going to basically hang this thing on every democratic policy. It's like their equivalent now of socialism. You just say whatever it is socialism or is critical race theory. And that's bad for Democrats because it's regarded as, alien or unpatriotic or whatever. And, do most American parents believe that their children shouldn't learn about slavery or inequality? Of course not. I mean, it's sort of ridiculous. But that's the kind of, image that Democrats, the left, has come to be saddled with. And so, my general view is we'd be much better off on the left getting out of the business of fighting cultural wars and get back to, defending people's need for health insurance, good schools, good jobs, good wages, et cetera, because that's what most people are worried about. And many of these concerns are the concerns of, more educated groups, college educated and above. And, but that's who runs the Democratic Party now, right? I mean, it's no longer the party of the working guy, the working man of, FDR and, through the Johnson years. So it's changed very dramatically. And the concerns and interests of the Democratic Party have changed accordingly. And that's been a problem. I think that's a big problem. I mean, I think it's part of what got Trump elected. And Trump may be losing his grip on the Republican Party at present. It's not entirely clear. Some people certainly think that. But culture wars is their thing, and they just turn out to be better at it. So my view is, we'd be better off being more lunch pail kinds of progressives, if you like.
John, I really appreciate what you're saying. And I think it's very interesting to look at Brazil and the US, comparatively, particularly given, the high levels of inequality and the racial question in both countries. So I never really thought I'd hear from an American professor that this idea of citizenship as something for us to look at as this more universal category. So that's very interesting, because when I was in grad school in the US in the 2000s, what we witnessed was that down here in Brazil, citizenship seemed to be the answer to most of our questions, while in the US, we were at the height of multiculturalism, right? And now it seems that has flipped somehow. But still, one of the things that has really struck me in our conversation here today is the absence of the idea of universal health care here, right? As a way of actually impinging upon these inequalities and these longstanding culture wars and ways of looking at that. Because that is one of the things that sort of worked in Brazil during the pandemic, right? The fact that we have a not so perfect but universal healthcare system that sort of offset some of the other troubles that we have. So I'd like to hear from you, because it seems to me that afterwards, what we have is a return to old American questions. The question of racism, it might be recast in new ways after George Floyd, but it's still there and it's still more or less the same. And the question now of gun violence in schools, right? So these are issues that predated the pandemic, and that's basically all that people talk about there. But this was a health crisis aside from an economic crisis. So what has happened? Is there anything going on in that direction in the US in terms of rethinking universal health care?
Well, first of all, I would not say that just because I said it, that there's any great sea change in views about the importance of citizenship. I mean, I'd like to think that was correct.
Okay, yeah.
Not sure it is.
That wasn't fair.
And I mean, it's sort of a homely idea, I think, right? I mean, in its kind of earlier incarnation, a la T.H. Marshall, for example. But T.H. Marshall was a social democrat. I mean, there was a reason he thought this was an important institution, and it had to do with sort of trying to corral economic inequality, which he took for granted as a natural product of the economy that we live in. So, or that he lived in at least. And so, I mean, it almost seems sort of corny, but I think, as I say, it is what's available immediately to hand as a way of thinking about, how do we all kind of pull in the same direction? And, for many, many people, I think that obviously involves things like universal health insurance. And it was one of the big problems during the pandemic, as I think, mentioned in the talk about, why certain groups, guess what, Black and Latino, were disproportionately, killed by COVID because they had to go to work. They were less well off. They couldn't afford not to go to work. They didn't have health insurance. They didn't have the wherewithal to get good care when they were sick, and they died. And, that seems to me something we obviously have to fix. I mean, I don't know that you would get a lot of argument about any of that from, any kind of progressive. I mean, the gun violence thing is a somewhat different phenomenon. And, I always think about, a famous, at least a then famous, dissident or critic of the East German regime who had, been seriously mistreated by that regime before 1990 or 1989, who was terrified she'd been invited to a conference in Detroit, and she was terrified. She had this image, not incorrect, of Detroit as an incredibly dangerous place, at least by her standards. And so, I mean, you may be thinking about the most recent mass shootings, which obviously are horrifying events, and God forbid your own kid is involved in this. I mean, it's terrible. But the mass shootings are not really the problem. There are 45 deaths by guns, 45,000 deaths by gun in the United States every year. More than half of those are suicides. So, obviously there's a mental health component to this, but the real issue is the accessibility of a weapon that makes your attempt to kill yourself a lot more likely to succeed, right? If you're trying to stick your head in the oven or, turn on the car in the garage and gas yourself, I mean, it just doesn't work as well. It may well work, but not as easily as a gun. So, and of course it's just, I mean, it hasn't always been this way, this sort of gun culture and the NRA as the standard bearer of, the idea of freedom and the Second Amendment and all this is only, basically 60 years old. So it's not like it's been this way forever. And therefore, presumably, one could beat it back. But for now, people in Congress, certainly Republicans, feel like they can't, buck the NRA, although the NRA is, not the organization it once was either. It's had a lot of problems internally. But in any case, I mean, the basic problem is, that it's too easy to get your hands on a gun, including, a military style weapon that, I'm perfectly happy if people want to hunt deer in deer season in Pennsylvania, and they want a rifle to do that with, that's fine with me. But we don't need people who can kill, 100 people in 2 minutes. And handguns are obviously also a huge problem. But, this has all gotten mixed up with the idea of freedom. And, as you all know, the United States, if American exceptionalism means anything, it probably has something to do with these ideas of freedom from government and control and influence. And the gun thing has come to embody that particular syndrome. Mm-hmm. And, I was reading something this morning to the effect that, a guy named Chris Murphy, a congressman or senator from Connecticut, is trying to say, well, we need to come up with a law that, as a result of which Republicans will get political rewards for supporting something that restricts access to guns. So that's obviously a very difficult compromise to find. Otherwise, we would do it more. So I'm hopeful that there are some, that this moment will bring some opportunities for improvements. But, we've been here so many times before, and it's appalling. I mean, but for now, there's just gridlock on this issue, and it's a public health issue, of course. But it's fundamentally, it seems to me, it's about access to guns, and that has to be fixed.
Definitely. Thank you.
Sure.
Sergio?
Yeah, no, I'd like to bring some questions sent by the students, but they sent the questions before based on on a discussion on the pandemic and social inequalities, and they read a text by Jorn Terborn, which is somehow related to some issues you have just addressed and other issues. Therefore, I will try to adapt to questions sent by them. The first question sent by Chem Patricia Pui Antonella, and the question is connected to, at least in Terborn's text, there is a sort of announcement or wish for a post-neoliberal era. And the question from the side of the students, how a post-neoliberal era could look like. So, and I think you actually brought some points on this. So more citizenship, more welfare structures, and so on. But perhaps you can comment on this. What could be this post-neoliberal era, especially in terms of state configuration? And the second question is also connected to an argument developed by Tambon, in which there is a connection between social inequalities, anti-democratic feelings, and actually right-wing movements. The question was sent by Craig, Michael, Hannah, and Yvain. So I imagine that you connect the emergence of right-wing movements or sort of new right movements much more to some instrumentalization of politics, of identity, than to social inequalities. But perhaps you can go on this and comment on what is, so to say, the importance of social inequalities for the emergence and the expansion of anti-democratic feelings.
Okay, I'll try. I mean, this is a big territory, but you know, I mean, I guess I think that far right kind of politics in the United States has been, you know, to a considerable extent, a response by, you know, less well-off white populations in industrial parts of the United States who, you know, who've seen their industries and their jobs and their lives get upended by, you know, globalization, by offshoring of jobs and this sort of thing. And, you know, insofar as there's an identity politics aspect to it, there is this kind of notion that, I mean, Arlie Hochschild wrote about this in her book about, I'm going to forget the title, but it was a huge hit right before the election in 2020. But
strangers in our country,
strangers in our own land, strangers in our own land. So the idea that there are these people who somehow got here and got, you know, in the queue ahead of us, and that we're sort of getting screwed because of them and they don't deserve it, and that's sort of some of the things I was talking about before. And, you know, I think this sort of grand or great replacement theory is a, you know, is an important aspect of this stuff. This has been around for quite a long time, I think. But it, you know, and some of it is anti-Semitic. I mean, it was interesting to hear somebody talk about the Buffalo, you know, massacre, which was clearly aimed at Black people. You know, this commentator was describing it really basically as an anti-Semitic motivation. And because if you go back to the Unite the Right rally in 2000, whatever it was, 17, you know, that was what they were saying was happening, right? The whites, you, in that case, Jews, but also Blacks and others, you know, you will not replace us. And so there is this fear of, you know, a transformation of the population that's going to mean that, you know, white populations who have been dominant historically are going to lose some of that dominance. I mean, I should really, you know, call attention to my colleague Richard Alba's book, The Great, I think it's called The Great Demographic Illusion, which is basically, I mean, it's not exclusively an argument against this replacement theory business, but is an attempt to say that, you know, we're not going to be a majority minority society or minority majority society, you know, in 2050, as whatever the predictions, you know, say, because many people who we may think of as non-white don't necessarily think of themselves as non-white. And the fact that you have a lot of Latinos drifting into the Republican Party now is a kind of sign of this, right? They don't see themselves as somehow, you know, oppressed non-white people. They see themselves as lucky to be in the United States, taking advantage of whatever entrepreneurial activities they can get their hands on, sending their kids to better schools than they went to, in Mexico or wherever they may have come from. And sort of, it's a big opportunity. They're very happy to be in the United States. They don't see themselves as, part of the worldview of some of the progressive left. And so, I think those phenomena are very important for us to think about when we think about, far right politics. There's definitely a sense, I think, among many of these people that, that they're being replaced by people who are not like them. And, they've had the experience of their job, heading to Mexico or South Korea or wherever it went, and their community is decimated, and, they don't know what to do. And, and Trump, whatever else you want to say about him, I mean, I think for a lot of people, they felt like he was their guy. I mean, it seems odd to us that a billionaire could seem to channel the needs and desires of, working class people in Akron, Ohio. But, it's partially the way he talks, and partially what he talks about. But, they found him their guy. And we have to think about why that happened. And not just dismiss them as, the famous basket of deplorables. So I don't know if that's useful for those two questions, but I hope that helps.
Do we have any more questions coming along? Everyone's quiet here today.
Actually, you are run out of time, but yeah, if there is an urgent question, yeah.
No? Okay. So just announce that for next week, we have a Q&A with Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty from the University of Chicago. Right now, to end this, I would like to really, really thank Professor John Torpey for being here, for sharing his thoughts with us, and for this very provocative afternoon. And we're all very, we're already thinking about what's going to come up in the next discussion here. So thank you so much for that, John, and thank you, my colleagues. Go ahead, Saj, you want to wrap up?
No, it's fine. Just to thank you also very much for the discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, John. That was great.
Yeah,
It was great. Talk to you soon.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation, of course, and great to see you all, and outstanding discussion, very helpful for me